Crime Documentary presents one of the most gripping and controversial trials in modern history. A case that had the entire world glued to their screens, debating guilt, innocence, and the flaws within the justice system. This is not just a murder. Trial it is a cultural storm, a moment where celebrity, race, power, and crime collided in a way never seen before. Tonight, we bring you the shocking story of the trial that stunned the world. O.J. Simpson's shocking murder case. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear is a tale of blood, fame, betrayal, and a verdict that still haunts history. All began on the night of June 12, 1994, when the quiet neighborhood of Brentwood, Los Angeles, was shattered by the gruesome discovery of two lifeless bodies. Nicole Brown Simpson, the ex-wife of football legend O.J. Simpson, and her friend Ronald Goldman lay brutally murdered outside Nicole's home. The scene was something out of a nightmare, the kind of image that lingers in the back of your mind, long after you try to push it away. Nicole's body was slumped near the front steps, her throat cut so deeply it was nearly severed. Ronald Goldman, a young waiter and friend of Nicole's, was found nearby, stabbed multiple times in what appeared to be a desperate fight for his life. The air was still, the blood still fresh, the neighborhood utterly silent except for the echo of sirens approaching. Police officers who first arrived on the scene later admitted they would never forget what they saw that night. The brutality and rage behind the killings sending chills through even the most hardened investigators. The investigation quickly began, and suspicion almost immediately turned to O.J. Simpson. O.J. wasn't just anyone. He was one of America's most beloved sports figures, a man whose dazzling football career and charm had made him a household name. He was the smiling face in commercials, the actor in movies, the hero who had transcended the sport to become a cultural icon. But beneath the polished public image, there was a darker reality, a history of domestic abuse that Nicole had endured for years. Police reports, 911 calls, and friends' testimonies painted a picture of a marriage filled with fear and violence. Nicole had told people she was scared, that she felt like O.J. would eventually kill her, but many dismissed it as the painful exaggerations of a broken relationship. On that June night, her worst fear had seemingly become reality. Detectives noted drops of blood leading away from the crime scene, almost like breadcrumbs pointing toward the truth. One trail led directly to the back of Nicole's home, while another seemed to stretch out into the night. It didn't take long before they made a critical decision. They needed to check on O.J. Simpson. When they arrived at his Rockingham estate, just a few miles away, O.J. wasn't home, but what they did find shocked them. There was blood on the door, blood inside his car, and in the back, an infamous discovery: a single black glove. Later at the crime scene, they found its match, soaked in blood. For investigators, the pieces began falling into place, the puzzle slowly forming an image they couldn't ignore. News of the murders spread like wildfire. By the next morning, the media had descended on Brentwood, and America was caught in the grip of a story that felt both surreal and tragic. Nicole was a mother of two young children, Sydney and Justin, who had been asleep inside the house when the murders took place. The thought of the children waking up to a world without their mother added another layer of heartbreak. And then there was Ronald Goldman, an innocent young man in his 20s who had simply come by to return a pair of sunglasses Nicole's mother had left at the restaurant where he worked. His life had been cut short in the most violent way imaginable, and his grieving family would become one of the most enduring voices demanding justice. Jay was soon notified of Nicole's death, and while cameras captured his stunned reaction, detectives were already circling in. His behavior after the murders raised eyebrows. He gave conflicting accounts of his whereabouts, seeming to shift his timeline depending on who was asking the questions. Investigators noticed cuts on his hands, which he struggled to explain. While the official line from police was that O.J. was not yet under arrest, the truth was that they were closing in, quietly building their case. And when they finally requested that O.J. surrender himself, it appeared that the tragic story of a brutal double homicide was about to explode into something much larger. Because this wasn't just any murder investigation, this was the beloved O.J. Simpson, a man adored by millions, now standing at the center of a nightmare. The public couldn't look away. Television news ran constant coverage, anchors whispered in grave tones, and tabloids filled their front pages with speculation. How could a man who once symbolized achievement and success in America now be accused of the most heinous crime imaginable? For many, it was unthinkable, yet for others, it made chilling sense, especially as stories of Nicole's abuse came to light. The case became more than an investigation. It was entertainment, tragedy, scandal, and obsession all rolled into one. America was divided, holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next, and then came the moment that changed everything. When police expected O.J. to quietly surrender at LAPD headquarters. Instead, what unfolded would become one of the most unforgettable spectacles in television history, an event that would mark the beginning of a trial destined to stun the world. Just days after the horrific discovery of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman's bodies, the Los Angeles Police Department issued an order for O.J. Simpson to surrender himself. The expectation was simple. The once celebrated football star would arrive at the station, escorted by his attorney, and face the charges that were now mounting against him. But what happened instead would go down in history as one of the most surreal spectacles ever broadcast on live television. On the morning of June 17, 1994, O.J. failed to appear. His attorney, Robert Shapiro, announced that Simpson had disappeared. Panic spread instantly. Prosecutors feared a flight attempt, the public braced for scandal, and the media sensed a storm. The LAPD declared O.J. a fugitive and issued an arrest warrant. Almost immediately, America found itself watching a manhunt unfold in real time, and the entire country froze in disbelief. O.J. had not simply vanished without a trace. He was in the company of his longtime friend and former teammate, Al Cowlings. Driving together in a white Ford Bronco, the two men suddenly became the center of the world's attention. When police located the vehicle, a chase began, but this was no high-speed pursuit filled with squealing tires and screeching brakes. Instead, it was almost eerily slow. Cowlings kept the Bronco moving steadily down the highways of Los Angeles while dozens of police cars trailed behind, lights flashing. News helicopters circled above, broadcasting every second of the chase to millions of households. People stopped whatever they were doing to watch. Restaurants tuned in their TVs, families gathered in living rooms, bars overflowed with customers glued to screens. More than 95 million Americans were suddenly watching the same thing, transfixed by the bizarre image of a beloved sports icon on the run inside the Bronco. The tension was even more dramatic than what appeared on the screens. O.J. was reported to be in the back seat, holding a gun to his head. Friends and family members had been contacted, pleading with him over cell phones not to end his life. Some reports later described him as distraught, rambling about his innocence, his children, and his despair. Police, fearing a tragedy on live television, held back from aggressively stopping the vehicle. Instead, they allowed the slow speed pursuit to continue, hoping to de-escalate the situation and prevent the night from turning even darker. The highways of Los Angeles became eerily transformed that day. Cars pulled to the side of the road. Drivers and passengers stood outside, waving and shouting encouragement to O.J. as the Bronco passed. Some held signs that read, "Run, O.J., run." Others cried out in disbelief, unable to reconcile the smiling man they had cheered on the football field with the desperate fugitive in the back of a car. The chase stretched on for hours, gripping the nation like a suspense film unfolding live. The surreal nature of the event even overshadowed other major broadcasts that evening. Game 5 of the NBA Finals between the New York Knicks and Houston Rockets was interrupted as television networks switched to the Bronco pursuit. Announcers, players, and fans found themselves distracted by the real-life drama unfolding hundreds of miles away. It wasn't just a news story anymore. It had become a cultural moment, the kind of event people would remember exactly where they were when it happened. The image of that white Bronco, crawling along the freeway with a line of police cars in tow, became one of the most iconic visuals in American history. Meanwhile, back at Simpson's estate, crowds gathered as police and reporters prepared for what they believed would be his eventual return. Friends of O.J. made desperate phone calls, hoping to talk him out of harming himself. His attorney, Robert Kardashian, even read a note to the press that many believed was a suicide letter, in which Simpson spoke of his love for his family and his despair over the accusations. The emotional weight of the situation hung heavy over everyone watching. Would this end in handcuffs or in tragedy broadcast live to millions of viewers? Finally, after hours of this nerve-wracking spectacle, the Bronco returned to O.J.'s Rockingham estate. Crowds lined the streets, police surrounded the area, and cameras captured every angle. In the tense standoff that followed, negotiators pleaded with O.J. to surrender peacefully. After what felt like an eternity, the door finally opened. O.J. emerged, weary and shaken, and allowed himself to be taken into custody. He was led inside his mansion briefly before police escorted him away in handcuffs. The world exhaled collectively, stunned at what had just unfolded. The chase had ended without bloodshed, but the shockwaves were only beginning to spread. For millions, the once golden hero now appeared broken, and the image of him hiding in the back of a Bronco would forever redefine his legacy. What had started as a double murder investigation had now become a full-blown media phenomenon. The question of guilt or innocence was no longer just a matter for police and prosecutors. It had become a national obsession. Every detail of O.J.'s arrest, every photograph, every word was dissected on television and in newspapers. The story had gripped the United States like no other, combining celebrity, violence, scandal, and race into one combustible narrative. Prosecutors believed they finally had their man. But as the world was about to learn, proving guilt in the courtroom would be far more complicated than it appeared on paper, and the trial that followed would soon eclipse even the Bronco chase in its intensity and spectacle. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric, unlike anything seen before. Rows of reporters filled the seats, sketch artists captured every expression, and cameras broadcast the proceedings into homes across America. The O.J. Simpson trial was no longer just about justice for Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. It had become a stage where fame, race, celebrity, and the very credibility of the justice system were on trial. Prosecutors stepped forward with what they believed was overwhelming evidence. There was DNA from blood samples that connected O.J. directly to the crime scene. Drops of blood were found at his Rockingham estate, in his white Bronco, and even inside his home. The scientific results were clear matches so rare that the odds of it belonging to anyone else were astronomical. Alongside this, the prosecution presented bloody shoe prints matching a rare and expensive pair of Bruno Maglio shoes, the same size worn by Simpson, linking him to the scene in yet another damning way. To the average person, the case seemed airtight, a web of forensic proof that tied O.J. to the murders. Yet the defense, famously dubbed the Dream Team, had other plans. Led by Johnny Cochran, Robert Shapiro, Robert Kardashian, and F. Lee Bailey, they orchestrated one of the most aggressive and calculated defenses in modern history. Their strategy was not simply to refute the evidence, but to dismantle the credibility of the investigators themselves. They argued that the Los Angeles Police Department was riddled with corruption and racism. That evidence had been mishandled, contaminated, or even planted to frame Simpson. At the center of their attack was Detective Mark Foreman, the officer who had discovered the infamous bloody glove at Simpson's home. Cochran and his team painted Foreman as a racist with a history of using racial slurs. And when Foreman took the stand and ultimately pleaded the Fifth Amendment, rather than answer questions about whether he had ever falsified evidence, the defense seized the moment. To many watching, the trial shifted in that instant. It was no longer about DNA or forensic science, but about whether the police could be trusted at all. The glove itself became one of the most iconic moments of the trial. Prosecutors, convinced it would solidify their case, asked Judge Simpson to try on the gloves found at the crime scene and at his home. As cameras zoomed in and the courtroom held its breath, Simpson struggled to fit the gloves onto his hands. He stretched his fingers, grimaced, and repeatedly shook his head, appearing as though they were far too small. For the defense, it was a gift. Cochran later delivered his now legendary phrase during closing arguments: "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." Those words reverberated far beyond the courtroom walls, becoming a cultural catchphrase that symbolized the entire trial. What should have been a straightforward presentation of forensic evidence had turned into a theater of doubt, and the defense knew exactly how to use it. As weeks turned into months, the trial unfolded like a soap opera. Jurors were sequestered, shielded from outside influence, but confined in a bubble that made the experience exhausting and surreal. The media dissected every testimony, every facial expression, and every courtroom exchange. Forensic scientists explained DNA evidence to the public in detail, while commentators debated endlessly on television. The case wasn't just about the murders anymore. It had become a national conversation about race relations, celebrity culture, domestic violence, and whether America's justice system favored the rich and powerful. Polls revealed a deep divide in public opinion. Many white Americans believed O.J. was guilty beyond a doubt, while many black Americans saw him as a symbol of resistance against a system they felt had long been unfair and oppressive. Even the cult of Ozeve. Jurors themselves felt the weight of history pressing down on them. The evidence was dense, often technical, but the defense's narrative was simple and compelling. O.J. was being framed by a racist system, determined to bring down a successful black man. Each dramatic moment in court reinforced this idea, from Foreman's refusal to answer questions to the glove demonstration that seemed to undermine the prosecution's confidence. The prosecution, meanwhile, struggled to maintain control of their narrative. They had the science, the statistics, logic, but they were battling against a defense that knew how to appeal to emotion and perception. It was as much a battle of storytelling as it was a battle of facts. The emotional toll on the families of the victims was devastating. The Goldmans sat through testimony after testimony, their grief etched across their faces, desperate for justice. For Ronald, Nicole's family, equally heartbroken, watched as the trial often veered away from her suffering and instead became a referendum on the police. The pain of the victims' loved ones was frequently overshadowed by the larger-than-life drama unfolding between attorneys, investigators, and O.J. himself, who sat at the defense table each day, his expressions scrutinized endlessly by millions of viewers. Sometimes he appeared stoic, other times emotional, and his presence alone carried a weight that few defendants in history could ever match. The trial dragged on for more than 8 months, making it the longest in California history at the time. By the end, both sides delivered closing arguments that underscored the clash of narratives. The prosecution insisted that the mountain of evidence pointed to one conclusion: O.J. Simpson was guilty of brutally murdering Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. The defense countered with their polished theme, reminding jurors again and again that doubt was their duty, that corruption had tainted every shred of evidence presented. The world waited anxiously as the jury deliberated, the tension thicker than ever, because what they decided would not only determine the fate of one man but would reverberate through the entire country and beyond. On October 3, 1995, the world stopped. After 8 long months of testimony, over 100 witnesses, and a trial that had been broadcast into millions of homes. The jury returned to the courtroom. The air inside was heavy with anticipation. Lawyers sat rigid. Family members of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman braced themselves for the moment they had waited for. And O.J. Simpson himself appeared tense, shifting in his seat, eyes scanning the room. Reporters whispered into cameras as the presiding judge asked for silence. 12 jurors who had been sequestered for 265 days were about to deliver a verdict that would echo through history. The clerk read the decision. Not guilty. Gasps erupted. Some cheered. Others wept. And a wave of disbelief spread across the nation. It wasn't just a courtroom decision, it was a cultural earthquake. The reactions outside mirrored the divide within the courtroom. On the steps of the courthouse, crowds erupted in celebration, dancing and shouting as if a championship had been won. In living rooms across the country, some people cried tears of relief, convinced that O.J. Simpson had been targeted unfairly by a corrupt system. At the same time, other families sat stunned in front of their televisions, anger and grief coursing through them as they felt justice had been denied to Nicole and Ron. The verdict split America along lines of race, class, and experience with the justice system. For many African Americans, it was a symbolic victory in a time when police brutality and systemic racism were daily realities. For many white Americans, it was the ultimate miscarriage of justice, proof that wealth, fame, and clever lawyering could outweigh even the most overwhelming evidence. The Goldmans were devastated. Fred Goldman, Ron's father, later described the verdict as a knife to the heart. Nicole's family wept quietly, knowing that no court decision could bring her back, but still shattered by what they saw as a failure to honor her life with justice. To them, the evidence had been clear, the violence undeniable, and the brutality beyond comprehension. Yet the man accused of it all had just walked free. For O.J., the verdict meant not just freedom, but a chance to walk out of the courtroom with his head held high. Cameras captured his smile, his tears of relief, and the embrace of his defense team, who had successfully delivered the impossible. Johnny Cochran declared it a triumph, a reminder that the system could work even for those long oppressed by it. But to many, it wasn't a triumph at all. It was proof that the system could be manipulated, that justice could be bent, and that truth was sometimes drowned in spectacle. The impact of the trial extended far beyond the walls of that Los Angeles courtroom. Television networks had broadcast the verdict live, and nearly 150 million people worldwide had tuned in. Workplaces came to a halt, schools stopped classes, and people everywhere gathered around screens, holding their breath. When the words, "Not guilty," were spoken, it was as if the entire world exhaled together, yet in completely different directions. Conversations erupted instantly, arguments broke out, and friendships were tested. It was a verdict that no one could ignore, a line in the sand that defined an era. The O.J. Simpson trial became more than a legal proceeding. It became a mirror reflecting the deepest divisions in American society. Even after the verdict, the story did not fade. In 1997, the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman pursued a civil lawsuit against O.J. Simpson. This time, the burden of proof was lower than in a criminal trial, and the outcome was very different. A civil jury found O.J. liable for their deaths and awarded the families $33.5 million in damages. Yet by then, the criminal verdict had already cemented its place in history. The phrase "the trial of the century" was no exaggeration. It had changed the way Americans viewed their justice system, the way the media covered crime, and the way celebrity intersected with accountability. Court TV had turned legal proceedings into entertainment, and the O.J. Simpson case had turned into the ultimate reality show, complete with heroes, villains, drama, and controversy. In the years that followed, O.J. Simpson's life spiraled further into chaos. He faced financial troubles, public backlash, and eventual imprisonment on unrelated charges years later. His legacy, once defined by athletic greatness, became forever tainted by the shadow of the murders and the trial that followed. Nicole and Ron, the true victims, were often overshadowed by the fame of their accused killer. Their lives, their potential, their family's grief, these were sometimes lost amid the endless debates about gloves, DNA, and courtroom theatrics. Yet their absence remained the most haunting reminder of what began that June night in Brentwood. The trial that stunned the world still lingers in collective memory because it was never just about one man or one crime. It was about the fault lines running through society: power, celebrity, gender, and justice. It exposed the fragility of truth in the face of spectacle and revealed how the court of public opinion can sometimes outweigh the court of law. Decades later, people still ask the same questions. Was O.J. Simpson guilty, and did he escape justice because of who he was? Or was he the victim of a system so flawed that doubt was inevitable? There may never be a definitive answer that satisfies everyone. But what cannot be denied is that this case changed everything: how trials are conducted, how media shapes narratives, and how America confronts its deepest divides in the end. The trial that stunned the world was more than a trial. It was a story of loss, of betrayal, of a nation split in two. Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman lost their lives in the most brutal way imaginable, and their families lost far more than any court could ever return. O.J. Simpson walked free, yet his freedom came with a lifetime of controversy and suspicion. The Dream Team secured victory, but justice itself was left fractured in the eyes of millions. The trial ended in 1995, but its impact never truly ended. It lives on as a haunting reminder that truth is not always simple, that justice is not always clear, and that sometimes the world can be stunned not by the crime itself, but by the verdict that follows.